Mr. James Carter stood at the entrance of the Grand Oak Hotel, a man of quiet confidence and remarkable humility. At 65 years old, he was a picture of elegance wrapped in simplicity. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and a pair of reading glasses rested on the bridge of his nose. He wore a classic navy blue suit, slightly worn but pressed to perfection, paired with a simple tie. While his appearance wasn't flashy, it radiated dignity and wisdom gained through years of perseverance. Born in a small, impoverished town, James had grown up knowing the sharp sting of hunger and the weight of societal expectations. His mother, a domestic worker, often reminded him that hard work and education were his only tickets out of the cycle of poverty. James took those words to heart. As a child, he worked odd jobs to support his family, shining shoes and selling newspapers on the streets. Despite the obstacles, he excelled academically, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university. Armed with an engineering degree, James eventually founded a construction company. Over decades, he transformed it into a global conglomerate, responsible for iconic skyscrapers and bridges across continents. His company's motto, "Building Dreams," brick by brick echoed his personal journey. Though immensely wealthy, James never forgot his roots. He invested in underprivileged communities, built schools, and funded scholarships for promising young minds. Despite his accomplishments, he remained humble, preferring quiet evenings at home to extravagant galas. Tonight, however, he was stepping into a different world. The Grand Oak Hotel towered above the city skyline, an opulent testament to old money and exclusivity. Its towering glass facade reflected the warm hues of the evening sun, while its ornate entrance, framed by marble pillars, spoke of grandeur reserved for the elite. A red carpet stretched from the curb to the front doors, where uniformed doormen greeted guests with practiced smiles. Inside, the lobby was a symphony of wealth crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a soft glow on the polished marble floors. Plush armchairs and velvet couches were strategically placed near roaring fireplaces, inviting guests to bask in the luxury. Every detail, from the intricate gold trim on the walls to the fresh floral arrangements adorning the reception desk, screamed sophistication. Yet, beneath the hotel's impeccable facade lay an unspoken air of exclusivity that was not just about wealth, it was about appearance and status. The staff, trained to cater to high-profile guests, often made judgments based on outward impressions. To the untrained eye, their smiles were welcoming, but to someone like James, who had endured a lifetime of subtle slights, the undertone of condescension was unmistakable. As James entered the lobby, he felt the weight of stares. His well-worn suit and weathered briefcase didn't align with the hotel's typical clientele. He walked to the front desk, his confident strides belying the quiet storm brewing inside him. The receptionist, a young woman with a pristine uniform and a practiced smile, glanced at James briefly before returning her attention to her computer. "Yes," she asked, her tone clipped and disinterested. "I'm here for the charity gala," James said, his voice calm but firm. She frowned slightly, her eyes flicking over him. "Are you sure? This is an exclusive event." James raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, a man in a tailored suit, likely the hotel manager, approached. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the general manager, joined him shortly after. Her presence was commanding, but not in a warm way. She exuded the kind of authority that often intimidated those who didn't fit her standards. "I believe this gentleman may be lost," she said with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. James kept his composure. "I assure you I'm not. I was invited to tonight's gala." Mrs. Harper's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she replied, "We'll need to see some identification." James complied, pulling out a sleek black invitation card. It bore the logo of the event sponsor and his name embossed in gold lettering, James Carter. The staff exchanged quick glances. The receptionist stammered, "Oh, I apologize, sir. I'll, inform the organizers." But Mrs. Harper wasn't so quick to let him pass. "Perhaps there's been some mistake," she said smoothly. "This event is quite exclusive." James's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't let anger show. Instead, he responded with a measured tone, "Mistakes do happen. Let's confirm with the organizers, shall we?" The tension in the air was palpable. Other guests in the lobby, dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between James and the staff. After a few moments, Mrs. Harper waved him off dismissively. "We'll handle this," she said. "You can wait over there," she gestured to a corner near the entrance, far from the grandeur of the lobby's central seating area. James didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked to the designated spot, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, he felt a familiar ache, the sting of being judged, not for who he was, but for how he appeared. As James waited, his mind wandered to past experiences where similar prejudices had tried to hold him back. He thought of the time he was denied a loan because the bank manager didn't believe a young black man could run a business. He remembered the countless boardrooms where he had to prove himself 10 times over to be taken seriously. Nearby, a young bellhop named Sam watched the interaction unfold. Sam, new to the hotel and still learning its unspoken rules, couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. He had read about James Carter in the news, how he donated millions to charity, funded scholarships, and helped rebuild entire neighborhoods after natural disasters. Seeing him treated so poorly didn't sit right with him. Sam approached James discreetly, pretending to adjust a nearby vase. "Sir," he whispered, "is there anything I can do to help?" James smiled kindly but shook his head. "Thank you, son. I'll handle it." At that moment, a woman entered the lobby. Dressed in an elegant black dress, she exuded confidence and grace. She glanced at James briefly, her expression unreadable, before making her way to the reception desk. Her presence was magnetic, and the staff scrambled to attend to her. Unbeknownst to anyone, she was closely observing the situation. Her connection to James would become clear later, adding a layer of intrigue to the story. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you look or where you come from? Imagine being someone like James Carter, a self-made billionaire, yet still facing this kind of treatment. What would you do in his shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the rest of this powerful story. Mr. Carter stood near the corner of the Grand Oak Hotel's lobby, his calm demeanor belying the storm of emotions swirling within him. The scene that had just unfolded was a painful echo of the struggles he thought he had left behind. He adjusted his tie, a practiced motion that gave him a moment to collect himself. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the hotel's manager, watched him from the front desk. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her posture rigid. To her, Mr. Carter didn't fit the carefully curated image of the hotel's elite clientele. Despite his impeccable manners and the gold-embossed invitation card, she saw only what she chose to see: an older black man in a modest suit, standing out among the affluent crowd. "I'm afraid this event is for exclusive guests," she had said earlier, her tone clipped, her eyes scanning him with thinly veiled disdain. Mr. Carter, unruffled, had handed her the invitation. "I believe this should clear up any confusion." Mrs. Harper glanced at it, her expression souring. "Well, mistakes happen," she replied curtly. "Perhaps this was sent to you in error. Regardless, our policy requires us to verify everything thoroughly." The implication was clear, and it wasn't lost on Mr. Carter. But years of navigating such situations had taught him to remain composed. "Take your time," he said evenly. "I'll wait right here." Mrs. Harper's dismissive attitude was a bitter reminder of the hurdles he had faced throughout his life. As he stood in the corner, he couldn't help but recall similar moments when his capabilities were questioned, his accomplishments ignored, and his worth judged by his appearance alone. His mind traveled back decades, to his younger years. James Carter, a young man with big dreams, had once walked into a bank to secure a loan for his first construction project. He had prepared meticulously, armed with blueprints, market research, and a solid business plan. But the loan officer, a gruff man in his 50s, hadn't even glanced at the documents. "Young man," the officer had said, "we don't usually approve loans for high-risk ventures like this." James had understood the unspoken words, the prejudice lurking beneath the surface. "I'm not asking for charity," he had replied, his voice steady. "This is a sound investment, if you'd just look." "I'm sorry, son. This isn't going to work," the officer had interrupted. It had been a crushing blow, but James hadn't given up. He had worked tirelessly, taking on odd construction jobs, saving every penny until he could fund the project himself. That first building had been the foundation of his empire, a testament to his resilience. Now, standing in the Grand Oak Hotel, he felt the same sting of dismissal. The same sense of being deemed less than, but this time, he wasn't a young man with limited resources. This time he had the means to respond. Nearby, Sam, a young bellhop with a kind heart, watched the interaction with growing unease. He had been working at the hotel for just a few months, but he had quickly learned to recognize the subtle and not-so-subtle ways certain guests were treated differently. Sam had seen Mr. Carter's name on the guest list earlier that day. He knew exactly who he was, the billionaire philanthropist whose company had donated millions to rebuild communities after a devastating hurricane. It didn't sit right with him to see someone like that treated so poorly. As he walked past Mr. Carter, pretending to rearrange a vase on a side table, Sam whispered, "Sir, I'm really sorry about all this. If there's anything I can do." Mr. Carter looked at him and smiled faintly. "Thank you, son, but I've dealt with this before. I'll handle it." Sam nodded, his respect for Mr. Carter growing. He wished he could do more, but he knew his position offered little influence. Meanwhile, at the far end of the lobby, the elegant woman in the black dress observed everything. She leaned casually against a marble pillar, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. She had arrived shortly after Mr. Carter and had watched the entire interaction unfold. Her name was Ms. Vanessa Blake, a sharp-witted attorney and a trusted advisor to Mr. Carter. She had worked alongside him for years, handling complex business deals and navigating the intricacies of corporate law. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was planning something, and the way he carried himself now told her he was already devising a response. Vanessa approached the front desk under the pretense of checking in. She spoke to the receptionist in a low voice, her sharp gaze flicking briefly toward Mrs. Harper. From her position, she could overhear the staff whispering among themselves about Mr. Carter. "Did you see his suit?" "Definitely not our usual crowd," one of them murmured. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she made her way to the lounge area, keeping Mr. Carter within her line of sight. After a few minutes, Mr. Carter's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. He had been expecting the call. "Right on time," he said under his breath as he stepped outside to take it. Vanessa watched him go, a knowing smile playing on her lips. She didn't follow him, she trusted he had everything under control. Outside, Mr. Carter spoke quietly into the phone. "Yes, I'm here. No issues. Just a minor misunderstanding. Let's proceed as planned." The conversation was brief, but the weight of it was significant. As he hung up, his calm expression remained unchanged, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. Returning to the lobby, he nodded politely to the staff and took a seat in the corner, as though nothing had happened. Mrs. Harper, however, couldn't hide her irritation. She had expected him to leave, humiliated, but his composure unnerved her. The tension in the air was palpable, and it wasn't just the staff who noticed. Guests began to whisper, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. As the evening wore on, the charity gala began to fill the hotel's ballroom with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft strains of classical music. Yet, in the corner of the lobby, Mr. Carter remained seated, his posture relaxed but his mind working at full speed. He observed the comings and goings of the staff, noting details that most people would overlook. The way Mrs. Harper barked orders at her team. The nervous glances exchanged by junior staff members. The careful choreography designed to ensure only a certain type of guest felt truly welcome. Sam, passing by again, couldn't help but pause. "Sir, I really think someone needs to hear about this. It's not right." Mr. Carter looked up at him, his smile warm but his voice steady. "They will, son. In time." Sam didn't fully understand what Mr. Carter meant, but something about his tone made him believe it. Later in the evening, as the gala reached its peak, Vanessa joined Mr. Carter in the corner. She didn't sit but stood beside him, her arms crossed casually. "Everything in place?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "It's already done." Vanessa smiled. "Good. Then let's enjoy the show." The two of them remained there, unnoticed by most, but their presence was far from idle. The seeds of change had been planted, and the events of the evening would soon set them into motion. As Mr. Carter looked around the lobby, his expression was one of quiet determination. He had faced adversity before, and he had always emerged stronger. This time would be no different. While the hotel staff and guests carried on, oblivious to what was coming, Mr. Carter's comeback was already underway. And when it unfolded, it would be nothing short of transformative. Weeks passed since the night James Carter had quietly walked out of the Grand Oak Hotel, leaving behind a lobby buzzing with whispers and judgmental stares. The staff, particularly Mrs. Harper, had long forgotten the misunderstanding with the older man. The hotel's routine exclusivity and grandeur continued uninterrupted until the unexpected announcement shook their world. The Grand Oak Hotel, an iconic establishment synonymous with wealth and prestige, had been discreetly sold. The news spread like wildfire, leaving both staff and regular guests baffled. A mandatory staff meeting was scheduled in the Grand Hall, a space usually reserved for the most elite events. Employees whispered among themselves, speculating about the identity of the new owner. Mrs. Harper, dressed in her sharpest tailored suit, stood at the front of the room, her expression betraying both confidence and curiosity. After all, she was the face of the hotel, a cornerstone of its operations. Surely the new management would rely on her experience. The murmurs in the room fell silent as the double doors swung open. A familiar figure stepped inside, his stride calm yet commanding. James Carter, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that exudes understated elegance, walked to the front of the hall. His presence alone sent shockwaves through the crowd. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening as recognition dawned on Mrs. Harper and the staff who had been present that fateful evening. Mrs. Harper's face went pale, her previously confident posture faltering. James stood at the podium, surveying the room. His gaze lingered briefly on Mrs. Harper, whose lips parted in shock but produced no sound. Then he spoke, his voice steady and resonant. "Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Carter. I'm honored to stand before you today as the new owner of the Grand Oak Hotel." The room erupted into whispers. Staff exchanged incredulous glances, their disbelief palpable. Some of the junior employees who had witnessed the earlier incident looked at Mrs. Harper, awaiting her reaction. James raised a hand, and the room quieted. "I'd like to share a story with you," he continued. "A few weeks ago, I walked into this very hotel. I came with an invitation to a charity gala, eager to contribute to a cause I cared deeply about. But instead of being welcomed, I was met with suspicion, condescension, and, frankly, outright disrespect." Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably, her face flushing as the weight of his words hit her. James glanced at her but didn't address her directly. "Now, I've encountered discrimination before. It's nothing new to me. But what struck me that evening wasn't just the behavior I experienced, it was the culture that allowed it to happen." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning was audible. "After that evening, I made a decision," James said, his tone sharpening. "I decided to buy this hotel, not to punish anyone, but to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did." The twist landed with the force of a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Harper's carefully crafted mask of professionalism crumbled, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. James turned toward her now, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Mrs. Harper, you and I had a memorable interaction that night. You made it clear that I didn't fit your guest profile." His words were measured, devoid of anger, but their impact was undeniable. "Your actions were a reflection of a broader issue, one I intend to address." Mrs. Harper swallowed hard, her hands clenching the edges of her clipboard. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice shaky. James held up a hand, silencing her gently but firmly. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," he said, "but accountability is necessary." He turned back to the staff, his voice rising slightly to address the room. "Effective immediately, there will be sweeping changes to how this hotel operates. Inclusivity, respect, and excellence will be our guiding principles, not just for our guests, but for every single person who steps through these doors." He gestured to a row of seated HR and legal representatives at the side of the room. "We've already begun implementing new policies, including comprehensive staff training and leadership restructuring." Then he turned back to Mrs. Harper, his tone softening slightly but remaining firm. "Mrs. Harper, I appreciate the years you've dedicated to this establishment. However, it's clear that your vision no longer aligns with the direction this hotel is heading. As of today, your position here is terminated." A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Harper's face turned ashen, her hands trembling as she gripped her clipboard tighter. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. James gave her a moment before continuing. This isn't the end for you, Mrs. Harper. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, but that growth will need to happen elsewhere. Her eyes filled with tears, though whether they were of regret or anger was unclear. She gathered her things in silence and left the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor as the door closed behind her. James took a deep breath, scanning the faces of the remaining staff. Some looked uneasy, others deeply impressed. Sam, standing near the back, wore an expression of quiet pride. Now, James said, his voice lighter but still authoritative, let's talk about the future. I want every one of you to feel valued and empowered here. This hotel is not just about luxury, it's about people. And that means treating every guest, every colleague with the dignity and respect they deserve. The room began to stir, murmurs of agreement replacing the earlier tension. James's words resonated, especially with the junior staff, many of whom had experienced their own forms of marginalization. As he concluded, James's gaze landed on Sam. And to those who show integrity and kindness, even when no one is watching, thank you. It doesn't go unnoticed. Sam's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and gratitude flooding his expression. The subtle nod from James felt like a personal acknowledgement of his quiet support that evening. The meeting ended with a standing ovation, not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration for the man who had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for transformation. The staff and guests left the grand hall with a sense of renewed purpose, inspired by James Carter's leadership and vision. James lingered in the room for a moment, watching as the last of the staff trickled out. Vanessa approached him, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Well, she said with a smirk, that was quite the entrance. James chuckled. Sometimes, Vanessa, actions speak louder than words. But today I think we needed both. She nodded. I think you just set a new standard, not just for this hotel, but for anyone watching. James smiled, his gaze drifting to the chandelier overhead. That's the goal. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts somewhere. And for the Grand Oak Hotel, it starts here. As they walked out together, the once intimidating walls of the hotel seemed a little brighter, a little warmer. For the first time in a long time, the Grand Oak felt like a place where everyone could belong. The Grand Oak Hotel, once a fortress of exclusivity, was unrecognizable just weeks after James Carter took the reins. The transformation was swift but carefully orchestrated, a testament to Mr. Carter's vision and leadership. Gone were the unspoken rules that dictated who belonged and who didn't. In their place stood policies that emphasized equality, respect, and genuine hospitality for all. Staff underwent comprehensive training programs that went beyond surface-level service protocols. These sessions delved into unconscious bias, cultural competency, and the true essence of customer service. Facilitators, experts handpicked by Mr. Carter's team, created an open environment where employees could share their experiences and learn from one another. For some, the lessons were eye-opening, sparking moments of self-reflection. Sam was among those who thrived in this new culture. His quiet acts of integrity had not gone unnoticed by Mr. Carter. One afternoon, during a meeting with the leadership team, Mr. Carter turned to Sam and said, "You exemplify the values this hotel now stands for. I'd like you to step into a managerial role, guiding others to follow your example." Sam was stunned. For a moment, he couldn't find the words to respond. "Thank you, sir," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do my best to make you proud." "You already have," Mr. Carter replied with a warm smile. Under Sam's leadership, a ripple effect began to take hold. Junior staff members found inspiration in his humility and dedication. He led by example, ensuring every guest felt valued and every colleague felt heard. His office door was always open, and he made it a point to check in with employees, asking not just about their work but about their well-being. As the hotel's reputation began to shift, so did the clientele. The Grand Oak became a destination not just for the elite but for anyone seeking exceptional service and a welcoming atmosphere. Stories of Mr. Carter's bold takeover and the subsequent changes spread far and wide, attracting a new wave of guests who appreciated the hotel's inclusive ethos. For Mr. Carter, watching the hotel transform was both fulfilling and sobering. Sitting in his office late one evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The incident at the Grand Oak was just one chapter in a lifetime of facing prejudice and overcoming it. Yet, it represented a microcosm of a larger societal issue, the barriers that people like him had to break down, again and again, to be seen as equals. He thought about his late mother, who had always encouraged him to rise above hate with dignity and perseverance. Her words echoed in his mind: the way you respond to the world's unfairness will define you, not the unfairness itself. Turning to his desk, he opened a notebook where he jotted down ideas for future initiatives. He wanted the Grand Oak to be a symbol of change, not just a hotel but a movement. A place where people came not only to stay but to learn and grow. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper's absence was noticeable. Her abrupt departure had left a vacuum in the hotel's upper management, but it was a space quickly filled by more capable and empathetic leaders. For Mrs. Harper, the weeks following her dismissal were a period of deep introspection. Initially, she had been consumed by anger and humiliation, blaming Mr. Carter for what she perceived as an unjust punishment. But as the days passed, she began to replay the events of that evening in her mind. She remembered the look on Mr. Carter's face when she had dismissed him, the quiet dignity with which he had carried himself despite her treatment. It wasn't long before she realized that her actions had been rooted not in policy, but in prejudice. One afternoon, she sat by the window of her modest apartment, a stack of self-help books and articles about unconscious bias spread before her. For the first time, she confronted the uncomfortable truth about herself. She had perpetuated the very discrimination she had always claimed to abhor. With time, Mrs. Harper began to see her dismissal not as an end but as an opportunity for redemption. She enrolled in seminars and workshops on diversity and inclusion, determined to educate herself and unlearn the biases she had carried for so long. It was an easy change, never is, but she was committed to becoming a better version of herself. Months later, she penned a letter to Mr. Carter. It was short and sincere, acknowledging her mistakes and thanking him for holding her accountable. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "but I want you to know that I am working to ensure that I never repeat the harm I caused. For that, I owe you my deepest gratitude." When Mr. Carter received the letter, he read it twice before setting it down. He smiled faintly, not out of triumph but out of hope. He had always believed in second chances, and it seemed Mrs. Harper was making the most of hers. Back at the Grand Oak, the staff were settling into their new normal. The changes weren't without challenges, but the atmosphere was undeniably brighter. Guests left glowing reviews, not just about the amenities but about the warmth and professionalism of the staff. Employees, once hesitant and reserved, now worked with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, during a celebratory dinner in the hotel's ballroom, Mr. Carter stood to address the staff. "I want to thank each of you," he began, his voice steady and heartfelt. "This transformation would not have been possible without your commitment and belief in our vision. The Grand Oak is no longer just a hotel, it's a beacon of what we can achieve when we embrace change and treat one another with respect." The room erupted into applause, but it was more than just a gesture. It was a testament to the impact Mr. Carter had made, not just on the hotel but on everyone who worked there. As the evening wound down, Mr. Carter took a moment to engage with his broader audience, addressing the viewers who had followed the story online. "To everyone watching," he said, looking directly into the camera, "I want to ask, do you believe people like Mrs. Harper deserve a second chance? Can someone truly change if they're willing to confront their mistakes and grow? Share your thoughts with us. Your perspectives matter." His words lingered in the air, an open invitation for dialogue and reflection. It was a fitting end to a story that was, at its core, about transformation not just of a hotel, but of the people within it. For James Carter, the journey was far from over. But as he looked around the Grand Oak, at the faces of staff and guests alike, he knew that this was a beginning, a promise of what was possible when courage met compassion. A year had passed since James Carter took ownership of the Grand Oak Hotel, and tonight, the Grand Ballroom sparkled with life, celebrating the relaunch of what was now regarded as one of the most inclusive and welcoming hotels in the city. The air was filled with soft music, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of conversations, creating an atmosphere of joy and renewal. Guests of all walks of life filled the room, a vibrant tapestry of diversity. There were families, professionals, artists, and even those who had once considered the Grand Oak unattainable. The transformation wasn't just in the policy or the staff training, it was in the very soul of the place, which now embraced everyone who stepped through its doors. At the heart of the ballroom stood a plaque, newly unveiled, that read, "The Grand Oak Hotel rebuilt on the foundations of respect, equality, and excellence of vision by James Carter." The inscription was simple yet powerful, serving as a permanent reminder of how one moment of discrimination had led to an inspiring change. Guests paused to admire it, their expressions filled with admiration and hope. As the evening reached its peak, the lights dimmed slightly, and a spotlight illuminated the stage. James Carter, the man behind it all, stepped forward to a round of heartfelt applause. Dressed in a classic black tuxedo, he exuded both humility and confidence. His journey, from a dismissed guest to the visionary leader of the Grand Oak, was nothing short of legendary, and the room waited in anticipation for his words. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice calm but filled with warmth. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate not just a relaunch but a transformation, a new chapter for the Grand Oak Hotel." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. A year ago, this hotel represented something very different. It was a place of exclusivity, yes, but not the kind of exclusivity that inspires greatness. It was a place where the worth of a person was often judged by appearances, not by their character or contributions. And I know this because I experienced it firsthand. There was a murmur in the crowd as many recalled the story that had started it all. Some had heard it in the media, others had learned of it through whispers among the hotel's staff. But hearing it directly from James Carter carried a gravity that silenced the room. That night, he continued, "I could have walked away, angry and defeated. And believe me, I've faced moments like that many times before in my life. But instead, I chose to act not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been judged unfairly, dismissed, or overlooked." He gestured to the plaque. "This transformation wasn't about me. It was about creating a space where everyone feels valued, where respect isn't just a courtesy but a standard. And that's what the Grand Oak is today." The audience erupted into applause, but James raised a hand to quiet them, his tone shifting to one of introspection. "I want to share something personal with you," he said. "Growing up, my mother always told me, you may not be able to control how others see you, but you can control how you see yourself and how you respond." Those words carried me through the darkest moments of my life, from being denied opportunities to facing outright discrimination. And those words are why I stand before you today. He paused, his voice growing stronger. "But let me be clear, this change didn't happen because of me alone. It happened because of a team, people who believed in this vision and worked tirelessly to make it a reality." James turned toward the staff, seated at a special table near the stage. "To the employees of the Grand Oak, thank you. Thank you for your commitment, your openness, and your willingness to grow. This hotel would not be what it is today without you." Sam, now a confident and well-respected manager, felt his cheeks flush as James's gaze met his. The applause that followed was genuine, a recognition of the collective effort that had turned the Grand Oak into a symbol of hope. James's tone softened as he addressed the crowd again. "Of course, change is never easy. There are missteps, growing pains, and moments of doubt. But those challenges are what make the outcome so rewarding. Every day we have a choice to accept the status quo or to challenge it, to push for something better. And tonight, we celebrate the result of choosing the latter." He stepped back slightly, gesturing to the room. "Look around you. This is what progress looks like. People from all walks of life, gathered under one roof, sharing this moment. This is what happens when we choose to embrace diversity, to value each other for who we are rather than what we appear to be." The audience erupted into another round of applause, some rising to their feet, their enthusiasm genuine and heartfelt. James stood humbly, letting the moment wash over him. When the applause finally subsided, he stepped forward for his closing remarks. "I want to leave you with this thought," he said. "What happened here at the Grand Oak is a reminder that change doesn't begin in boardrooms or headlines. It begins with individuals, with you and me, taking a stand, speaking up, and believing that we can make a difference." He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his tone growing even more personal. "And to everyone watching this story unfold online, I ask you, what kind of change can you inspire? Do you believe in second chances as I do? Do you believe that someone can grow, learn, and contribute to a better future, no matter their past? If this story moved you, if it inspired you, then I encourage you to share it. Share your thoughts, your experiences, and your own stories of resilience and transformation. The room, and likely thousands watching the live stream, hung on his every word. Together, James concluded, we can build a world where everyone has a chance to thrive. One choice, one action, one moment at a time. The applause that followed was thunderous, the crowd rising to their feet in unison. James stepped back, his heart full, as Vanessa joined him on stage. Quite the speech, she said with a grin, her voice just audible over the applause. James chuckled. It's not about the speech, it's about the people. That's what matters. As the evening wore on, guests mingled, danced, and shared stories of their own. The ballroom, once a symbol of exclusion, now radiated with warmth and camaraderie. James watched it all with quiet pride, knowing that this was only the beginning. The Grand Oak Hotel had not just been reborn, it had become a beacon of what could be achieved when courage met compassion. And for James Carter, there was no greater legacy. As the evening began to wind down, the camera panned across the lively ballroom, capturing moments of joy, connection, and newfound purpose. Guests laughed, shared stories, and toasted to the future of the Grand Oak Hotel. James Carter stood off to the side, watching it all unfold. He turned to address the camera directly, his expression warm yet resolute. This story, he began, isn't just about a hotel. It's about what happens when we choose to act instead of turning away. When we challenge injustice, embrace growth, and believe in the power of second chances, we create something extraordinary not just for ourselves but for everyone around us. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer but filled with conviction. So, I ask you, wherever you are, what kind of change can you inspire? Have you ever been in a situation like this, where you faced or witnessed injustice? What did you do, or what will you do next time? He paused, letting the words settle. If this story moved you, share it. Share your thoughts, your own experiences, and what you took away from this journey. Together we can start conversations that lead to action. Change begins with us, every single one of us. He stepped back, offering a small smile. Thank you for watching. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of hope, resilience, and transformation. Let's continue building something great together. As the screen faded to black, the final image lingered on the plaque at the heart of the ballroom. The Grand Oak Hotel, rebuilt on the foundations of respect, equality, and excellence of vision by James Carter.